In the early months of 1914, the world stood on the edge of war. But one man had his eyes fixed on a different kind of battle, the conquest of the last unbroken frontier on Earth. His name was Sir Ernest Shackleton, a man whose courage burned as fiercely as the polar winds he sought to face. Standing at the London docks on a cold, misty morning, Shackleton watched the grand silhouette of his ship, Endurance, rocking gently against the gray waters of the Thames. Her masts reached skyward like the hopes of the men who would soon board her, bound for the southernmost tip of the world. The air smelled of salt, rope, and destiny. Shackleton's vision was bold, almost impossible, to be the first to cross the frozen continent of Antarctica, from sea to sea, through the pole itself. To many, it sounded like madness. To Shackleton, it was purpose. He placed an advertisement in the paper that would go down in legend. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success, and yet hundreds applied. Men of grit, curiosity, and quiet courage. They came not for fame or fortune, but for something deeper, the call of the unknown. Among them were names that would become immortal in polar history. Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal second-in-command; Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator; Thomas Crean, the indestructible Irishman; and even a young stowaway, Perce Blackborough, who had hidden himself aboard the ship in secret. On the 1st of August, 1914, as Europe slid into the Great War, the Endurance sailed from Plymouth, England. Shackleton offered to cancel the expedition and serve his country, but the Admiralty replied with one word: proceed. And so, they did, southward, into the wild white unknown. The voyage began beautifully. The men sang shanties, played banjo on deck, and marveled at the floating cathedrals of ice that shimmered under the southern sun. The Endurance glided proudly across the South Atlantic, toward the remote island of South Georgia, a whaling station perched on the edge of the world. The whalers warned Shackleton of an unusually cold season, of ice closing early and fast. Shackleton listened, nodded, and pressed on. For him, there was no turning back. By December 1914, the ship reached the edge of the Weddell Sea, a vast white desert of floating ice. The temperature dropped, the winds hardened, and the Endurance began to fight for every mile. Ice floes groaned and collided, squeezing the ship like a living beast. The men could hear it in their bunks at night, the deep moaning of the ice, like the earth itself breathing. Then, one terrible morning, the ship stopped moving. The Endurance was trapped. The crew hacked, pushed, and cursed, but the ice held her fast, a prisoner of the frozen world. Shackleton tried to stay cheerful, calling it a winter camp. He ordered the men to play football on the ice to keep their spirits alive. They hunted seals and penguins for food, took photographs, wrote in journals, and waited for the thaw that never came. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The ice closed tighter, squeezing until the timbers of the Endurance began to splinter and groan. Shackleton knew then the ship was doomed. On October 27, 1915, as the sun dipped below the endless horizon, the order came: abandon ship. The Endurance sank slowly into the white silence, her masts breaking, her proud hull disappearing beneath the ice. The men stood watching, helpless, as the heart of their journey slipped away forever. But Shackleton did not mourn long. He turned to his men and said, "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." Home, across 800 miles of drifting ice, with no radio, no maps, and no ship. They set up camp on the frozen sea, tents fluttering in the endless wind. Frank Hurley, the photographer, risked his life to save his glass negatives from the wreck, fragile pieces of history that would one day tell their story to the world. Through the long polar night, they waited, temperatures plummeting, rations shrinking, hope flickering like the pale green aurora overhead. Shackleton moved among them daily, keeping morale alive with stories, laughter, and faith. He knew that leadership in such a place was not about commands, but about heart. When the ice began to break beneath their feet, Shackleton ordered the march. They pulled their lifeboats and sledges across endless miles of shattered ice, their faces blackened with frostbite, hands raw from rope and cold. For days they battled blizzards and hunger, until they finally reached the open sea. With 3 small boats, James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, they set out across the stormy Southern Ocean. The cold was merciless. Waves rose like walls, soaking the men to the bone. Salt water froze on their clothes, turning them into armor of ice. Yet they rowed on, hour after hour, day after day, driven by the single burning will to survive. After 7 terrifying days at sea, they reached a small, barren spit of land, Elephant Island. It was the first solid ground they had seen in nearly 500 days. The men collapsed on the beach, laughing, crying, kissing the frozen stones. But Elephant Island was no salvation. It was too remote, too wild, far beyond the reach of any ship. Shackleton knew they could not stay. He made a fateful decision to take 1 boat and a handful of men to sail across 800 miles of the most dangerous ocean on Earth to reach South Georgia and bring rescue. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and 5 men climbed into the small James Caird. Behind them, 22 others waved goodbye, uncertain if they would ever meet again. The voyage that followed would become one of the greatest feats of navigation and endurance in history. For 16 days, they fought monstrous seas, freezing rain, and hurricane winds. Their tiny boat climbed mountains of water, then plunged into valleys of darkness. Navigator Frank Worsley guided them by glimpses of the sun through torn clouds, using only a sextant and instinct. They drank ice melt, ate scraps of seal meat, and bailed water non-stop to keep from sinking. Frostbite gnawed at their fingers. Sleep came only in moments. Shackleton never closed his eyes for long. He sat awake, watching over his men. At last, through snow and fog, the peaks of South Georgia appeared like ghosts rising from the sea. But the ordeal was not over. They landed on the wrong side of the island, separated from the whaling station by mountains no one had ever crossed. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean set out on foot. For 36 hours without rest, they climbed glaciers, crossed crevasses, and slid down frozen slopes in the dark. When they finally stumbled into the whaling station at Stromness, filthy, frostbitten, and hollow-eyed, the workers could hardly believe they were human. Shackleton's first words were simple: "My men! Are they safe?" The answer, not yet, but soon. It took 4 failed attempts and months of heartbreak before Shackleton finally returned with the Chilean ship Yelcho. On August 30th, 1916, he spotted the thin figures waiting on Elephant Island. As the rescue ship drew closer, the men cheered, cried, and waved their tattered flags. Shackleton stood at the bow, eyes burning with emotion. Not one man had been lost. They had survived the impossible, not through luck, but through loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between men who refused to surrender to nature's fury. Years later, explorers would speak of Shackleton's leadership as something beyond human, a light that could warm even the coldest place on Earth. More than a century later, the icy deep still holds the Endurance, discovered again in 2022, resting upright and perfectly preserved beneath the frozen sea. Her name still glows faintly across her stern, a message that outlasted the ice. Endurance. And so the story lives on. A story not of conquest, but of courage. Not of reaching the pole, but of reaching home. A testament to the indomitable spirit of the human heart. That even in the coldest, darkest corners of the world, hope endures.